Benjamin Franklin once said, "An investment in knowledge pays the best interest." Keep this in mind as we discuss today the recent treaty between China and Russia to get rid of the US dollar. What will it mean for you, for the international market, and for the global economy? My name is Dr. David Oualaalou.
And my name is Dr. Ross Stewart.
And you are watching Geopolitics in Conflict.
Today we're going to be discussing the trade between China and Russia. Annualized, it's about $200 billion before the pandemic. Well, those restrictions are going away now, and trade is hot between the two countries. Their goal is local currencies as opposed to the US dollar. That's what we'll be discussing today, the impact globally on the world economy.
Well, that's correct, Ross. That is a major issue into consideration as far as the impact that's going to have on the financial market. Just for our viewers to have an idea exactly what we're talking about here. It was a meeting last week between Russia and China regarding the preparation of the paperwork for the treaty that's going to enter into effect in 2025 regarding the dumping of the US dollar as the currency by which they conduct trades. Which means basically that China is going to be using the yuan, the Russians are going to be using the rubles, and that's how they're going to try to get rid of the domination of the US dollar. With this one, Ross, will have a major implications on a global market.
If you pay attention to the media today, you'll find a lot of distraction. You'll see things like and hear things like Australia and the Philippines and Japan and Taiwan and the United States and other countries are now in some sort of conflict with China. These are distractions against it take us away from the real issues here because we're looking at using the yuan and looking at the ruble as opposed to the US dollar. Yeah. International implications. The rest, distraction.
Yeah. Well, there are those who argue that, for example, the ruble or the yuan or the euro will not have the same strength as the US dollar. And I get that. I got it. And it's true. The US dollar still holds that strength on the global market. But at the same time, the US dollar, it's losing its momentum when you start to realize countries like China is going to move forward with transactions in its own currency, what that's going to do to the dollar. So most of the other countries that's going to be dealing with China, they're going to say, yeah, why do we need to go through the US dollar? We might as well just do it directly with our own currencies. That's where the change is. But also because the currencies, the euro, the yuan, the ruble, and so forth, they are more volatile in comparison to the US. But as we noticed recently, that the global market, when it comes down to the financial aspects of it, the US dollar is not as powerful as it used to be. So China is moving forward in this direction.
This is an issue I've been tracking for maybe 30 years. And I've heard both sides of this argument about, well, the US dollar, and it should be the medium exchange worldwide. And if it stops being that, what's the impact on the United States? I've heard all the way from panic to what a relief. So it's hard to have an opinion one way or the other on this. Do you have an opinion you'd like to share?
Well, actually, the US dollar will be like any other currency, the way it operates within its own borders. Yes, the US dollar is the global reserve that was set after the World War II, in the Bretton Woods system, in which the decision was made that the US dollar will be the global currency by which all the transactions around the world are carried out. Well, it's no longer the case, given if you take into consideration that China now is preparing the introduction of the digital currency. The United States itself is preparing for the introduction of the digital dollar.
Which is launching in January of 2021.
Yeah, which is only a few months from now. So you can just see why China and Russia decided to move forward with this. But this one also has some other implications far beyond that what's been reported. For example, When you look at, for example, the projects in the Arctic that China is involved in, Russia are involved in. As we mentioned in one of our shows, previous shows, we talked about the massive untapped oil reserves that tap about $35 trillion. So can you just imagine having access to that wealth, but you're doing the transactions in another currency beside the US dollar? And that's where China's thinking in terms of a long term.
As we both know, the Chinese are long-term players. And they have 5-year plans, 20-year plans, on and on. They're thinking long-term into the future.
And exactly, that is one of the reasons why they're doing this. Because this one is tied also to their BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, which is not going to be completed next year, as you and I know.
Right.
That's still in the works. However, China is preparing all this ahead of time, like you suggested. They think in terms of the next 15, 20, 25, 30 years. And this is where the issue now you hear in the West, well, China is not a democratic nation and so forth. Yeah, they are not, because it's a different system. However, their achievement, the objective they've reached thus far, didn't happen overnight.
Right.
That was the result of the last 25-year planning where they are today. And I give you just example for also our readers to, our viewers rather, to have an idea on it. Think of the transportation system, the infrastructure. Well, China built about 4,000 miles of rail that connected the east to the west. All of them high-speed trains, quality trains. And you wonder, why aren't we able to do this in the United States with all the resources we have? We couldn't build a speed train that can connect New York to LA? Makes you just wonder.
You know, I've ridden on those trains, and they are truly magnificent. Smooth, on time, fast. And I happened to be in the middle politically of one of those things when they were planning to do one between Dallas and Houston. And I saw the politics involved. Quite frankly, a particular airline shut it down. They had enough political punch that they could stop the fast rail between those two cities.
Yeah, and that is where the problem, as we always say, China is run by engineers.
The United States is run by attorneys.
Yeah, and this is where the issue is for why. For example, just on an example of the infrastructure in China, why China is moving forward, and they're looking at these terms in terms of maybe we need to get rid of the US dollar dominance altogether. And I think that's the plan for what they are trying to achieve. If you take into consideration that this treaty will enter into effect in 2025.
That's not very far away.
Not at all. Not at all. The other aspects that we think about it also, as I said, the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, it's because it's a major undertaking that Chinese have embarked on. Well, when you consider, for example, where the Belt and Road Initiative is going to go in Europe, it's going to go through Italy. Interesting enough is that the European Union just had a meeting with China. So which means the European Union is pivoting east, given that the shift of wealth has already begun.
Right.
So there is the wealth that has been transferring to the east. So the European Union is thinking in terms of, and companies in Europe, they're thinking in terms of, well, maybe we need to get into the Chinese market.
You know, if you pay attention to the media right now, they're telling the opposite story. They're saying how the Europeans are standing tall against the Chinese and all this conflict and controversy. And it isn't true when you look at what's the news behind the news.
And that's correct. Well, that one's just for domestic consumption, no more, no less. It's because the West is realizing there is no stopping to the progress China is making, and they will. Right. You know, I wrote an article recently about I titled it "How China Will Own the 21st Century," whether we like it or not. Because when you look at all the infrastructure taking place, yes, we might disagree with their system, which is, of course, is different than ours. But nonetheless, the progress they're achieving, it's based on a strategy and planning.
Well, don't you think that we as Americans ought to go into abject panic?
Apparently we need to, because this will have a major impact on how business is going to be operating moving forward. Because here's the thing, if you are a business owner and you're dealing with China, you're going to be in a position to decide, do I want to continue transactions with Chinese in their own currency or not?
The real question to me is, will it make really a difference for American business people?
Well, it will make a big difference because can you just imagine when you start to have, for example, a pair of Nike that costs $400? When you have a bike that costs $350, when you have house dishware that costs over $100,
As opposed to the commodities coming from China, which your Nikes are $75.
that's correct. So cheap labor plays a major role into this. Cheap commodities plays a major role into this. Given how our system is and the distribution of the wealth, without getting into that, the lack of inequality that exists in the American system, so all this is coming to the surface. And now, so if you are a business owner that you have some operations in China, you're going to have to be thinking hard because that decision will have to be made soon. 2025 is not that far.
Right.
So, and interesting enough is that China already conducting transactions with some countries like Pakistan, like Iran, in their currency. They're not using the dollar.
Well, the sanctions that the United States is putting in place are really sponsoring that kind of activity.
Are you referring to the sanctions on Iran?
Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah, those are unilateral sanctions. It's a snapback sanctions that they are ridiculous because how the United States can dictate to the world and think that the world's going to submit, that era is gone. So,
well, we're certainly getting enough pushback from Europe.
Well, actually, the whole members of the UN, there are only 15 countries. 15 countries out of 201 members of the UN supported the United States decision. When you have 145 countries disagreeing, that sends a message right there. But that beside the political aspects of that, we look at the economic aspects of it. Well, the economic aspects of it is that Russia, for example, there was just a meeting yesterday in Moscow between the Prime Minister of Iran, Javad Zarif, and the Prime Minister or Foreign Minister rather of Russia, Sergei Lavrov. And the decision was they're going to move forward with the transactions between Russia and Iran. And guess in which currency they're going to trade? The ruble and the dinar, whatever they use in Iran currency. So this is coming, whether we like it or not.
Well, we might have actually talk about semiconductors.
Well, that is an interesting point, Russ. Why is that interesting? Because China has declared that they're going to, from now on, they're going to build their own semiconductors. We're not going to be dependent. They are not going to be dependent on the U.S. And where is the link between China deciding on using its own currency and the semiconductor business? You can just see the link. Well, if China start producing, it's not if, they will be producing their own chips, their own, the European market is going to be moving and purchasing that from China, and China will be happy to sell that, of course, using the yuan rather than the dollar. So you can just see where China's thinking long term as to how this is going to impact all its global transactions, and they prefer to get rid of the US dollar dominance altogether because they've reached a point where they are saying enough is enough with the US strangulation on the global financial market. That's where I see them moving forward.
Let me ask you something that I've been really curious about for some time. There seems to be a tit for tat going back and forth between the United States and China. And so the tariffs go up and there's some sanctions to go in place and we stop semiconductor sales. And they say, well, we're going to stop supplying your medical equipment and your medical medicine and so on. I'm going, is this really a strategy that the Chinese are using? Or is this some petty thinking that's going on in some communist minds?
Well, no, it's not a parity thing, Ross. It's a strategy for them in the sense that they are standing up to the United States. And to them is much more of a saving face, if you will, part of the culture, that now we are not that subservient country they used to be 40 years ago. That era is gone. I mean, if you look at certain charts, I had a chance to read some articles pertaining to the comparison between the United States and China since 1980s. And when I looked at the graphs, how they were moving parallels till 2015, and they crossed, China crossed over the United States.
This in terms of economic growth?
Exactly. And because the idea was when we were hit with the financial crisis in 2008, which was almost similar to what happened in 1931, even though China was impacted by it, but not to the extent we were. So they kept growing, economically speaking.
Yeah.
And it was in 2015 when those two lines, the Chinese line crossed over and surpassed that of the United States.
David, what would you say is the bottom line for American business?
Well, the bottom line for American businesses is they need to decide what they're going to be doing comes 2025. Because comes 2025, that treaty between Russia and China will enter into effect, but also that will be a way for China saying, sure, we will do business with you, except that we're going to have to do it in our currency, not the US dollar.
So the bottom line that we'd like to invite you to consider is there's some news behind the news of what's really going on, what's really important to American business people. It is not India having fistfights with people in the mountains. It's not with some idle threats from Australia saying, we're going to punch China right in the nose. There are important things for your consideration, and we hope we set in motion your thinking on this so you can be planning for 2025.
Well, that's correct, Taras. I'm sure the information will be useful to our viewers. And as always, stay informed. Till next time. Bye-bye.